You can hear her breathing in the darkness, short, shallow gasps that fog the cold air of the stone chamber beneath the Palatine Hill. Princess Valeria is 17 years old, and her wrists are bound with silk cord and ironic mercy, considering what silk once meant to her. Through the narrow window slit, she can see torchlight moving in patterns across the forum below, can hear the distant roar of a crowd that has been drinking since noon, waiting for tomorrow's spectacle, waiting for her. She was, until 23 days ago, the daughter of a king whose name Romans now spit like a curse. She wore diadems that weighed more than Roman armor. Before we continue, I'd love to know. Comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from, because it fascinates me endlessly that a story buried for 2,000 years can reach someone reading this right now, wherever you are. This is Rome, 62 BCE, in the weeks following General Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus's conquest of the kingdom of Pontus. The triumph Rome's ultimate victory celebration is being prepared with the kind of meticulous cruelty that only comes from turning suffering into state ceremony. Valeria and her family are the centerpieces of that ceremony, living symbols of what happens when you resist Roman expansion. But what the histories rarely mention, what the marble inscriptions celebrating Pompey's glory conveniently omit, is what actually happened to the royal women once the crowds dispersed and the torches burned out. The fates considered so disturbing that even Romans who recorded every detail of their military conquests chose to write around them, leaving only fragments, hints, and the kind of deliberate silence that tells its own story. The preparation for a Roman triumph began weeks before the actual procession. Captives had to be kept alive but visibly diminished, healthy enough to walk but broken enough to satisfy the crowd's appetite for degradation. For male captives, this was relatively straightforward chains, inadequate food, public display in cages where citizens could observe them like exotic animals. For royal women, the process was far more complex, because what Rome wanted to destroy was not just their bodies, but their status, their dignity, the very concept that they had ever been anything other than property of the conqueror. Valeria had been separated from her younger sister Roxana 3 days after capture. She didn't know where Roxana was being held, knew only that the 14-year-old girl had been taken to a different section of the prison complex beneath the city. The separation itself was calculated easier to break prisoners who couldn't support each other, easier to extract compliance when the only information about loved ones came from guards who enjoyed delivering it in the cruelest possible terms. A guard had told her yesterday that Roxana was being prepared for something special, something the crowds would particularly enjoy. He wouldn't elaborate, just smiled with the satisfaction of someone who holds power over the helpless, and knows it. The door opened. Valeria didn't turn, had learned that showing attention to her captors only encouraged their enjoyment of her fear. But she recognized the footsteps, heavy, military, belonging to the officer who had visited her cell 3 times already. Tribune Gaius Cassius Martellus. He was perhaps 35, scarred from campaigns, his face bearing the weathered look of someone who had spent more years in tents than buildings. He carried no torch, suggesting he intended this visit to be brief. "Your sister," he said without preamble, "has been selected for additional display." Valeria's stomach contracted. What does that mean? General Pompey has decided that the triumph will include demonstrations, visual lessons for the populace about what happens to those who support kings who challenge Rome. Your sister, being young and symbolically pure, represents the future of your father's bloodline. The general believes her treatment will send a message that future generations will remember. The words were delivered with the clinical detachment of someone discussing military logistics. But Valeria had spent 17 years in a court where every word carried multiple meanings, where survival depended on understanding not just what was said, but what was being offered. This tribune was offering information he didn't have to provide. That meant he wanted something. What kind of demonstration? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Public humiliation involving animals. The specifics haven't been finalized, but the symbolism is clear royal blood, brought low by creatures Romans consider beneath even their slaves' attention. Your sister will survive it, physically, but what she represents will be destroyed. Valeria closed her eyes. She had heard whispers of such punishments, stories that circulated through royal courts as warnings about what Rome did to the daughters of defeated enemies. Stories involving horses, dogs, even exotic animals from the games, forced upon bound women, while crowds watched and cheered. The punishments weren't about death. Death was too clean, too final. They were about transformation, about turning a princess into something that could never again symbolize resistance or dignity. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you have something I want, and I have something you want. We can help each other?" She opened her eyes, turned to face him fully. In the dim light filtering through the window, his expression was unreadable, but his posture suggested negotiation rather than threat. "What could I possibly have that you want?" "Intelligence. Your father's treasury locations. The names of Roman officials he bribed during the war, and there were several, despite what the Senate would prefer to believe. The locations of supply caches that could still be used by resistance movements. Your family didn't just fight Rome. You undermined Rome's administrative control of the eastern provinces for 3 years. That required resources and connections we haven't fully mapped. And in exchange, I can change your sister's fate, not eliminate her role in the triumph. That's beyond my authority, but change what happens to her. Reduce the degradation to something survivable mentally as well as physically. And I can ensure that after the triumph, both of you are placed in a household where you'll be treated as guests rather than slaves." Valeria's mind raced through calculations her tutors had trained her to make. Verify what can be verified. Assume what cannot be verified is false until proven otherwise. Understand that anyone offering salvation wants something specific in return. You're offering this without your general's authorization. I'm offering this with my general's implicit understanding that valuable intelligence is worth more than temporary entertainment. Pompey is many things, but he's not wasteful. If I can deliver actionable intelligence about hidden treasuries and corrupt officials, he'll support my decision retroactively. And if you can't deliver, if I give you false information, then your sister suffers what was originally planned, and you suffer worse for attempting deception." He paused. "But I don't think you'll give me false information. I think you're smart enough to know that your only leverage is credibility." She was. She had been raised by a father who survived in a world of larger powers by being useful, by making himself necessary to Parthia, Armenia, and even Rome at different points. She understood transactional relationships. This tribune wasn't offering mercy. He was offering a trade her knowledge for her sister's reduced suffering. And reduced suffering was the only victory available. What about my mother? And the others? Your mother will walk in the triumph and likely be executed afterward. Her status is too high, and her age makes her unmarriageable, which means she has no future value to Roman families. The others, the lesser nobility from your father's court, their fates depend on factors I don't control. I'm offering what I can offer, your sister and you. That's the scope of negotiation. Valeria felt something tear inside her. Her mother, who had taught her to read Persian poetry, who had held her through childhood illnesses, who had prepared her for queenship with the same careful attention she gave to everything, would die, would be strangled in the traditional manner after being paraded through hostile streets, her death a punctuation mark on Poppy's victory. There was nothing Valeria could do about that. Accepting it was bitter as poison, but necessary. Save what can be saved. Let go of what cannot be saved. The arithmetic of catastrophe. I want to see my sister first. Verify she's alive and unharmed before I agree to anything. Martellus considered this. That's reasonable. I'll arrange it for tonight. But understand, if you agree to this arrangement, you commit fully. No partial information, no strategic withholding. Everything you know in exchange for everything I'm offering. I understand. He left without another word. Valeria sat in the darkness, listening to her mother's weeping through the wall, wondering if she should tell her about the choice she was about to make. Deciding, finally, that some burdens were hers alone to carry. Her mother would die not knowing that her daughters had been saved. It was a small mercy, perhaps the only mercy available, to let her die believing they would all meet the same fate, rather than living with the knowledge that she alone had been abandoned. The reunion happened in a different cell, larger and better lit, with guards stationed outside but not inside. Roxana ran to her the moment the door opened, threw herself into Valeria's arms with the desperate strength of someone who thought they'd never touch family again. She was thinner than she'd been 3 weeks ago, her face bearing bruises that suggested rough handling, but she was alive and coherent and herself. They said you might be dead, Roxana whispered against Valeria's shoulder. They said they'd executed the royal family. They lied. Romans lie to prisoners. Remember that. Believe nothing they tell you unless you can verify it independently. She held her sister at arm's length, examined her face, her arms looking for signs of worse treatment than bruises. Have they hurt you beyond this? They've mostly ignored me. Fed me enough to keep me alive, nothing more. But yesterday they came and measured me for something. Took my dimensions like I was being fitted for a dress. They wouldn't say why. Valeria felt cold certainty settle over her. Measured for restraints, almost certainly. For whatever apparatus the demonstration required. She had perhaps hours to prevent what was coming. Roxana, listen to me carefully. I'm going to make an arrangement that will change what happens to you during the triumph. It won't be pleasant. Nothing about this will be pleasant, but it will be survivable. Do you trust me? Always. You're the only thing I trust. Then don't ask me questions about what I'm agreeing to. Don't ask what I'm giving them in exchange. Just know that when it's over, when the triumph is finished, we'll be together. And will be safe in ways that most captives never are. She pulled Roxana close again, memorizing the feeling of her sister in her arms, knowing this might be the last private moment they'd have for weeks. I love you more than my own life. Remember that in whatever comes next, the intelligence extraction took 3 days. Martellus brought maps, documents, other officers who specialized in Eastern affairs. Valeria gave them everything. The location of the primary treasury at Amasis, hidden in catacombs beneath the temple district. the names of 3 Roman officials her father had bribed, including one currently serving as governor of Bithynia. The routes of supply networks that connected Pontus to Parthian allies, networks that could still be used by remaining resistance if they weren't disrupted. The locations of weapon caches, strategic defensive positions her father had prepared for prolonged war, contacts in other kingdoms who might harbor fugitive Pontic nobility. She held nothing back, partly because the bargain required it, partly because there was a strange relief in unburdening herself of secrets that no longer served any purpose. The kingdom was gone. The dynasty was ended. Protecting information that belonged to a destroyed state was pointless. Better to trade it for something tangible, her sister's reduced suffering, their eventual safety. Martellus verified what could be verified quickly. The Amisos treasury was raided within the week. Pompey sent a dispatch to Rome announcing the discovery of additional spoils that confirmed intelligence from valuable Avel sources. The bribed officials were investigated, at least one recalled to Rome under suspicion of corruption. The information was real useful, exactly what Martellus had promised to deliver, which meant he had leverage now to fulfill his side of the bargain. The triumph itself was scheduled for the calends of October, deliberately timed for maximum attendance. All of Rome would turn out for Pompey's celebration of Eastern conquest, eager to see the exotic captives, the displays of treasure, the visible proof that their general had extended Roman power to the edges of the known world. Valeria was prepared 2 hours before dawn. The silk cords that had bound her wrists were replaced with iron chains, heavy enough to be visible from a distance, designed to emphasize her captive status. Her clothing was changed to a thin tunic that preserved modesty but not dignity, the kind of dress that made it clear she was property on display rather than a person deserving privacy. Her hair, which hadn't been properly washed in weeks, was arranged in a deliberate mockery of royal styling, braided but messy, adorned with cheap bronze rather than gold. Roxana was brought to the same preparation area. Her chains were lighter, her clothing similar but even more inadequate. She looked terrified but controlled, the expression of someone who has accepted that fear is permanent but can still be endured. Valeria wanted to comfort her, to explain that the worst had been prevented, but guards stood too close, monitoring everything, making private communication impossible. Their mother was prepared last. She moved like someone already dead, her eyes focused on nothing, her body going through motions without apparent consciousness. She had been broken completely during her captivity, whatever interrogations or cruelties she'd experienced having destroyed something essential. Valeria felt grief mixed with guilt, grief for what her mother had become, guilt that she was saving her sister but had been unable to save her mother. But the guilt changed nothing. Save what can be saved. The procession began at the Porta Triumphalis, the gate reserved for victorious generals. Pompey rode in a gilded chariot, wearing the purple and gold of a triumphator, his face painted red in imitation of Jupiter's statue. Behind him came his officers, then wagons loaded with treasure and exotic weapons. Then the captive kings in chains. Valeria's father was already dead, executed weeks earlier, but other defeated rulers shuffled in heavy restraints. Then came the royal women. Valeria walked with her hands chained before her, the short lengths forcing small, humiliating steps. Roxana stayed close at her side, their shoulders brushing now and then, the only comfort available. Their mother followed behind, guided by guards who had to physically direct her movements. The crowds were worse than Valeria had imagined, not just in size but in hatred. They screamed insults in Latin she barely understood, their meaning unmistakable. Rotting food and filth rained down. A woman near the front shrieked that Pontic whores should be given to gladiators, her voice cutting through the roar. Valeria kept her eyes forward. Beside her, Roxana trembled, her breathing shallow and fast. Valeria pressed her arm against her sister's, a silent promise. We endure this together. Near the forum, the procession stopped. Guards began separating prisoners. Roxana was pulled from her side and led to a raised platform. This was the moment where Martellus's bargain would hold or fail. Roxana was forced to kneel before selected Roman citizens, to kiss their feet as a herald proclaimed Roman dominance. The crowd roared. It was degrading, theatrical, and survivable. No animals, no violation. Martellus had kept his word. The triumph dragged on for hours. By the time they reached the Temple of Jupiter, Valeria's feet bled, her wrists burned, and her dignity was gone. She no longer felt human, only endured. But she was alive. Roxana was alive. When they were led to the holding cells beneath the temple, and the guards finally left them alone, Roxana collapsed into Valeria's arms, sobbing with relief. For the first time since her capture, Valeria felt hope, not of restoration or revenge, but of survival. Simple continuation. Endurance that might one day become something more. Their placement was handled quietly. Through Martellus's arrangement, they entered the household of Senator Marcus Cassius Rufus as consultants, their royal origins reframed as qualifications rather than threats. They were given private rooms, decent clothing, and the chance to continue their education in exchange for translation work and cultural advice. It was not freedom, but it was safety. They ate regularly. They slept without fear. They had each other. Years passed. Valeria became fluent in Latin and indispensable to Eastern trade negotiations. Roxana studied medicine with Greek physicians. They adapted, becoming something neither Roman nor Pontic, shaped by catastrophe into new forms. Valeria never forgot the cost. Her survival and Roxana's had been purchased with secrets and a mother's life. The guilt never faded. But each morning, across the table, Roxana was there alive, growing, laughing. In the end, that was enough. They survived. Not triumphed, not won. Survived, and sometimes that was the only victory history never recorded.